Well, so as I said, we ended last week with we're basically with Paul's kind of return to Jerusalem with a big sack of money that he had brought with him is the offering to the churches of Jerusalem that he talks about in 2 Corinthians. We know that this offering was a critical part of his vision for the church. It was a deep symbolic significance for him. And just to kind of recap where we were, he basically we know Luke knows Paul has the money with him in Jerusalem, so he gives us several different signs that he knows Paul has brought the collection to Jerusalem. And then we have the very painful awareness that it really does seem that the Jerusalem church does not accept the offering on the terms that Paul is giving it, that he really wanted to lay it at the feet of the apostles. Has Barnabas laid his funds at the feet of the apostles? He really wanted to do that as a representative of the Greek Gentile church and to create, in a sense, this symbol of unity in the body of Christ, that's his vision. I mean, even to be able to talk about the body of Christ as something unified. We thank Paul for that. Paul's the one who gave us that language in Corinthians when he asked for the money. So it's just absolutely critical to our understanding of Paul. So instead, the Jerusalem church basically tells Paul, listen, we've heard some disturbing reports about you. You've got a PR problem, and actually we'd like you to take some of that money you brought and use it to perform a different sort of symbolic act. Totally different from the symbolic act that Paul was thinking, but the symbolic act that the elders of the Jerusalem church felt was best would be paying for the completion of the Nazirite vows of 4 other Jewish Christians who had come to the city and were shaving their heads. And that was something, again, I talked about how that was something where you gave a special gift to the temple for the shaving. And basically Paul was going to fund that observance and do it himself as an external act to show that he was fully observant with the Jewish ethos, meaning the Greek word ethos essentially means customs. It's translated in the NRSV often has customs. So that the kind of the Jewish customs of life, Paul was fully observant. And of course, as I pointed out last time, Luke says that throughout, basically makes clear that Paul was in fact faithful to the Jewish ethos when it came to his own personal observance, but he was just, in a sense, breaking down the barriers between Jews and Greeks whenever it prevented them from coming together in eating common meals, essentially in communion with each other. So Paul does it. He undertakes this symbolic act. And so in verse 26, then Paul took the men, and the next day, having purified himself, he entered the temple with them, making public the completion of the days of purification when the sacrifice would be made for each of them. So we pick up with verse 27. When the 7 days were almost completed, it's kind of like he's almost there. He's almost, but things go wrong, and it says in the NRSV, it says the Jews from Asia. It's like this isn't China that we're talking about. Asia in the Acts of the Apostles is the word for the Roman province in which Ephesus was the main city. These are the Ephesian Jews again. So if you remember the riot in Ephesus, and that Paul clearly, he avoids Ephesus on his way to Jerusalem on this trip, right? And it says he didn't want to stop in Ephesus, so he told the elders of the church in Ephesus, basically, come to me in this other town and meet me there. So, things were so hot for Paul in Ephesus, and here they are, again, the Jews from Ephesus see him in the temple. So this is again, an indication that the Jewish diaspora community, this isn't a large group of people, right? In the sense they would have all known Paul by sight, and pilgrimage to Jerusalem, what this also indicates is that pilgrimage to Jerusalem was something that was frequent. So you would, in the course of kind of normal life, you would have pilgrims from Ephesus there in Jerusalem at any given time, right? And so it's like, hey, that's the guy who was in Ephesus, and so it's like we couldn't get him here, but we couldn't get him in Ephesus, but you better believe we can get him here. Right now he's on our turf. He can't go appealing to some local magistrate and flash his citizenship badge around. Now we're going to get him. And so they find him in the temple and stir up the whole crowd. And this stirring up of the crowd in the temple is precisely what Herod and the Sadducees were so afraid would happen in Jesus's time. That is, that has Jesus, you remember Palm Sunday, has Jesus, he storms the temple, has the prophetic act of purifying it, stopping its worship. And it was this sort of temple disturbance that everybody was on edge about in Jerusalem. And we know that from several sources. Josephus tells us this. We can see it in the gospel accounts that this sort of, in a sense, basically a riot in the temple is that's something that puts the Romans on DEFCON 5. I mean, it's something where it's like the Romans would be ready to turn the key on this city if they see this sort of riot breaking out. So they stir up the whole crowd. They seized him shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help! This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against our people, our law, and this place. More than that, he has actually brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." So this is the background of this, and this is in these two paragraphs where Luke describes this incident of the riot in the temple. This rings absolutely true to the politics and the scene of and the kind of the context of the times. That is that Luke knows, and you need to know that we have there are archaeological inscriptions from the temple that basically there were in large letters were carved in the entrance into the forecourt of the temple. Basically, that anyone who comes in here who's not of the people is to be killed. I mean, basically, it's like the death penalty for Gentiles if you enter this place. And any Jew who would bring a Gentile into that place would, of course, be under the death sentence, right? And so basically, this is something that would get people stirred up enough to basically create, again, there's going to be some mob justice. There's like kind of like, in the South, it'd be like, get a rope. It's like, this is, he's a cattle rustler. This is something we got to handle. And with of course, again, with the ethnic overlay onto it. So here's the Ephesian Jews. This is what got them so upset. For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. So again, this just shows you how small he is. It's like, wait a second. Trophimus is, they evidently around Jerusalem. Remember, Jerusalem is not a metropolis. It's not the modern city that you go to visit. I mean, it's a small place with lots of people packed in. So these Ephesian Jews, they see a guy from their city, and they're like, wait, and then they see Paul in the temple with a group of, and they knew that Trophimus hung around with Paul in Ephesus and was part of his crew there. So they leap to the conclusion that Paul must have brought Trophimus in with him to the temple. And so, the kind of the stage is set by this false accusation. And again, we have a link to the trial of Jesus and the passion of Jesus, where you have a false accusation that gets leveled against him by witnesses. So basically, that's what's happening. This is the charge, and what, in a sense, what we think Luke is doing by making sure that it's Jews from Ephesus that are making the charge. He wants you to be sure to draw the conclusion that it's the Jews from Ephesus that were telling on Paul to the Jerusalem church. This is clearly, now we can connect the dots. Oh, that's because otherwise you'd be kind of like, where would they have heard that? Where would James have heard that? Well, they were hearing it from Jews from the city of Ephesus who were really clearly out to get Paul. And by stirring up the temple, the Jerusalem church had itself that basically would have a PR problem, right? And basically because what would happen is Ephesian Jews would come in and say, hey, this Paul guy who's with James and all these guys is out there telling Jews they shouldn't be Jews anymore. And so you can imagine kind of James and the elders are sitting there going, we thought we gave Paul an order. I mean, we told him that he wasn't allowed to do that. So they're in a mind. James and the elders are a persecuted minority within Jerusalem. So we know that. So in a sense, on the compassion side, we can understand to a certain degree why James and the elders would want Paul to kind of make a sign that simmers things down. Unfortunately, it backfired on them. Basically having Paul frequent the temple grounds was something that provided, in a sense, the predicate for mob justice that was about to follow. So unhappily, it didn't work out the way they wanted. So then all the city was aroused and the people rushed together. They seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. And we know that this would be the procedure for responding to some sort of threat to the temple. The Levites, their job, they had gatekeepers with swords, and the temple police is one of their main jobs was not only to be sure to screen out Gentiles and make sure Gentiles didn't enter, but also to close the doors of the temple and basically make it into a fortress if they needed to, if there was a riot or other disturbance. One of the threats of a riot would be that in the melee that would occur, ritually unclean persons would, kind of in a big fight, would somehow get pushed into the temple grounds, or you'd have, or God forbid, a big crowd or mob would somehow find itself pushed into the Holy of Holies. In a sense, it's like if you had that large group of people, you had to protect the Holy of Holies, because if they got inside, if a mob got inside, you wouldn't be able to hold them off. So they closed the temple doors. And so it's both literally, we know this historically would be something that they would do. Josephus talks about it, that this would be a response to any perceived threat. And Luke also wants to note, this is a detail. Why does Luke tell you this detail? That he tells you specifically that they shut the doors. It's not just for, kind of historical accuracy. There's also the symbolic nature of the fact that Paul is, in a sense, shut out from his people, right? In a sense, the doors closing in the temple is just as symbolic as the curtain being torn in two at Jesus's death. In a sense, it's a way of saying that Paul has been excommunicated from the Jewish people, and he won't enter the temple grounds again, right? So this is something that is kind of like that. And it's almost like the way has been blocked. And also we wonder if this is a theological statement as well, that in a sense, this is the last time we see a follower of Jesus go into the temple. Remember early on in Acts, like Peter and James and John were going into the temple every day at the hour of prayer to, participate. They give their testimony in the temple. They're preaching Jesus in the temple. So early in the narrative, the temple is a main area for Christian mission and worship life. But after this point, we don't see anyone go into the temple anymore in the narrative of Acts. Not that, say, the Jewish Christians never did, kind of off screen, so to speak, but in the narrative, what this is indicating, in a sense, is kind of a closing of options, that this is finally gone. There's been the temple is really no more a place for Christians to be. As they shut the door on Paul. So picking up with verse 31, while they were trying to kill him, and so you can imagine, so like maybe Paul's companions, and there might be some people who are trying to kind of try to get him out. It's chaos. It's a total melee, and the crowd is trying to kill him. Word came to the tribune, or in Greek it's the chiliarchs, the commander of 1,000. And the chiliarchs is typically who would be in charge in Jerusalem for the Romans when the governor isn't there. It was so Pontius Pilate being in Jerusalem, the Roman governor would be a very rare occasion, right? The Roman governors typically, they stayed in Caesarea Maritima. That was their town. Right, that's where they had all the goods. It's a seaport. It's nice. Weather's nice. It's the beach. Blah blah blah. So going, trekking all the way up to this primitive capital, in this province that you're stuck governing would not be on the high list. But so that's part of the Gospels, kind of how history comes together in the Gospels. That the fact that both Pontius Pilate and Herod are there in Jerusalem at the same time was in the Gospels is itself a testimony to kind of God bringing circumstances together for the trial of Jesus, right? So, the normal. Picking up where I think I left off, it's hard to tell. So basically, we have the tribune, we have the commander of 1,000, right? So they went and got the commander of 1,000. And immediately he took the soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. When they saw the tribune and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. So it's just this kind of like, nothing, we're not doing anything. We're not doing anything. So it's like teachers in the room, stop pounding on little Billy. So they stopped beating Paul. Then the tribune came, arrested him, and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. He inquired who he was and what he had done. So again, this is kind of the Roman version of justice. Basically, there's a riot, they're beating the crap out of somebody, and you arrest the person they're beating up. It's like he must have done something wrong. So it's like they arrest Paul, and then he asked the crowd, and he asked, and he doesn't ask Paul who he was or what he'd done. He asked the crowd, right? He said, "So tell me what this guy did." Some of the crowd shouted one thing, some another, and as he could not learn the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him to be brought into the barracks, which basically means brought into the Antonia fortress. So you just imagine the crowd shouting, and again, probably there are some people in the crowd who don't even know why they're there, or what Paul has done. I mean, again, this is a classical Greco-Roman riot. So you got lots of people, again, in Ephesus. Remember the riot in Ephesus, where people really didn't even know why they were there. They were just started shouting. So speaking of shouting, then when Paul came to the steps, the violence of the mob was so great that he had to be carried away by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Away with him! Away with him!" Again, this should be reminding you of something, right? We've seen this movie before. This is the Passion, right? There's the Passion of Jesus. Oh, crucify him, away with him. So again, what Luke is shaping his narrative and shaping the way that he tells this story. And again, we can assume that Luke might have been might have had a very good chance of actually being there with Paul, as Paul is in the temple. And so, so Luke is in a sense shaping the telling in order to help us draw the connections between Jesus and his passion and Paul and his martyrdom, the ultimate martyrdom of Paul, right? So for Paul, the trial and the martyrdom are separated by several years. But for Luke, from the perspective of writing after Paul's death, for Luke, that's not as important as the fact that the pattern followed that of Jesus's. That's the important thing for Luke. So they bring him on the steps of the Antioch fortress. And again, by the way, that's exactly where Jesus was, that's where Pontius Pilate brings him out to the crowd. Jesus out to the crowd and says, what do you want me to do with him? So it's almost on the same steps that this is all happening. So just as Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, may I say something to you? The tribune replied, do you know Greek? Then you are not the Egyptian who recently stirred up revolt and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness? So, by the way, we know from Josephus and other sources that this actually happened in 54 AD. There was an attempted revolution or a takeover of the temple by an Egyptian Jew who had his followers meet him on the Mount of Olives. And the idea was they were going to go down basically the same way. Again, this should tell you again why Jesus's Palm Sunday procession was so upsetting to the authorities, because the Egyptian who leads this revolution, and we don't know his name, even from Josephus doesn't tell us his name. It's just an Egyptian. He's kind of a mystery guy. He has his followers meet him at the top of the Mount of Olives, and their idea was they were going to go down and assault Jerusalem and try to take the Antioch fortress by force and kick the Romans out, and that would usher in the, basically with their version of the first coming, we would say the second coming, right? But basically it would usher in the apocalyptic day of the Lord by doing so. Now, the Romans, of course, they weren't born yesterday. They've been running empires for a very long time. They knew about this guy, and they surround his forces, and they killed a whole bunch of them. They slaughtered him, and the Egyptian actually ran away. Again, unlike Jesus, the Egyptian ran away into the Judean wilderness. And for those of you, I'm looking at like Scott, remember where I showed you the wilderness there in Jerusalem and said Jesus could have gone just down the hill and run away into the wilderness and they never would have been able to find him. Well, that's what the Egyptian does. He runs away with a couple of his followers and basically vanishes, leaving all his followers, of course, to get it in the neck, or actually the palms of their hands from the Romans, right? That's what, so the Romans kill a whole bunch and they crucify a whole bunch. And so this is 54 AD. We think this might be 56, 57 AD. I mean, this is really, so this is only a couple of years before. And so the Tribune has an honest, it's realistic for the Tribune to think maybe that guy tried to come back in because he vanished. The Romans never caught him. And maybe he's come back and tried to start his riot right here in the temple and get things going. But it also, Luke shows you just how, Paul is cool as a cucumber. I mean, so he's basically been kind of beaten half dead. He's being dragged in from basically a rioting mob that wants his blood. And he has the presence of mind to turn to the tribune and says, may I say something? In Greek, why does he do this in Greek? Because Paul is no dummy. He knows exactly that if he can speak Greek, so, his perfect Greek that he learned in Tarsus, that would cause this tribune to say, whoa, wait a second. Who do I have in my hands here? You know, I've got somebody who's basically, if somebody who's speaking the Queen's English, right? It is like, this, you know, you're not, you know, part of the rabble. You know, it's you know, you're clearly, you're coming from Oxbridge somewhere. You know, you must have a family. So Paul, so, and that's the case. Paul replied, I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of an important city. And of course, Luke, he uses the latotes, the literal translation, a citizen of no mean city, right? In Tarsus, we know Tarsus actually was a very important city in that region. I beg you, let me speak to the people. And so, you know, so Paul basically asked to make his apologia, his defense to the crowd. Now, this is the one part of this story that that New Testament scholars, that basically everything up to this rings absolutely true. The details are you know, so you have this absolutely, this is totally realistic. We're not sure if a Chiliarches would actually be willing to let Paul address a mob that was in the midst of a riot. That might be, this might have happened a little bit later or the next day or something, but the fact that, you know, a tribune would actually allow this to happen in the heat of the moment, we're not so sure. That strikes us as psychologically real. However, Paul's presence of mind is something that we do know to be a part of his character. And so we, you know, it's possible that this did happen, and perhaps the Chiliarches was, in a sense, so overawed or impressed by the fact that Paul has the presence of mind to speak perfect Greek, and to let him know that he's a citizen, he's a Roman citizen of a city. It's like, whoa, okay, well, have at it, sir. You know, so it's possible that he may have yielded to Paul and allowed him to make this address. So when he had given him permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned for the people for silence, or to the people for silence. And then when there was a great hush, he addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying, so then now Paul, again, this is perfect Greek rhetoric. This is, you know, he speaks Greek to the tribune, you know, because the tribune, you know, that would impress the tribune. And now he's going to speak Hebrew to his own people. It's the principle of doing that which is fitting or proper to your audience for the moment. So he addresses them in Hebrew. Brothers and fathers, listen to the defense I now make before you. And defense, the Greek word there is literally apologia, right? An apology, right? So he makes a formal apology. When they heard him addressing them in Hebrew, they became even more quiet. So it's possible that he addressed them in Aramaic, right? The common language of the area, but Luke uses the word Hebrew specifically, and he uses it twice, and it's something that will cause the crowd to hush down. What we think could be happening here is Paul, being a Pharisee of Pharisees, right? Raised in the strictest sect, he would be able to speak more or less classical Hebrew to the crowd. And in a sense, to the crowd, it would sound something like an actor starting to kind of speak in Shakespearean English. That is, Hebrew and Aramaic were very close, but you or I, unless we have I'll just speak for me. I'll speak in the first person. If I were seeing a play, a Shakespeare play, it would help me to have actually the text to read through, because in that English of Shakespeare's day, there are things that, like, if I read it, I can follow it, but to listen to it, it goes really fast, and it's hard to keep up with some of the differences in Shakespeare's English and our spoken English today. It'd be the same thing for Paul to start speaking in classical biblical Hebrew. He would do so in order to prove his bona fides, right? I am a Jew, and he's about to prove it to the people that are in front of him, because he's about to speak in the way that a Pharisee could speak, right? In the language of the scriptures. And indeed, Luke, in this speech, he reports the speech, the Greek that he uses, and again, in the English translation, you don't see this, but in the Greek that Luke uses here, he actually kind of uses old-timey language, kind of like their equivalent of Rite One, Koine Greek. And so Luke purposefully archaizes, or makes archaic the Greek that he basically writes the story in order to give you the feeling that Paul is speaking in kind of Rite One, vouchsafe, inestimable, and all, he would be speaking in kind of Hebrew, classical Hebrew versus Aramaic. And again, that's Luke's narrative artistry, right? He wants to indicate by even the diction with which he writes to help you get a sense of what Paul is trying to accomplish. And Paul is deliberately, and Luke shows in his translation of Paul's speech, he tries to help you see that Paul deliberately speaks in the language of the Old Testament scriptures, or basically for him, the scriptures. So he's going to try to speak to them and establish a bond with them on the grounds of the scriptures themselves. So he starts out, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia. Now note, he doesn't mention that he's also a Roman citizen. He's going to leave that part out for this crowd, right? He's going to stick with the Jewish part of his resume. So brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel. You remember we met Gamaliel in chapter 5, verse 34, right? So basically this is, 20 years on, and Paul says, hey, some of you might remember me, right? I was a graduate student in this department, and I've been on the road, but now I'm back. And so, I was here with Gamaliel. You all remember him. I was educated strictly according to our ancestral law. Again, this bears out with, hearing Paul's letters, especially Philippians, where he describes his upbringing as a member of the strictest sect of the Pharisees, a Hebrew of Hebrews. That's Paul's language. So this sounds like the way that Paul would describe himself as a Jew, being zealous for God, zealous in the zelotes. To be zealous is, in Paul's world, was a code word, and Jesus's world too, by the way, was a code word for being willing to use violence for the sake of Torah. To be, basically, if you were zealous for the law or zealous for God, it meant you were in that wing of the Pharisees that thought, well, we're going to observe the law ourselves, but this may take a little bit of blood being shed, to win this battle. And so he was on the side of, hey, if you need to do a little street justice on some sinners, hey, you gotta break some eggs to make this omelet, people. Okay, so to be zealous was a code word. It comes from the account, I think, in Numbers of Phinehas in the camp in the Exodus, and the Israelites were taking Moabite wives, and that displeased the Lord God. And so there was Phinehas who stood up, and he finds a couple in flagrante delicto inside their tent, and he runs them through with a spear, like through both of them. And in the text it says that he was zealous, but Phinehas, zealous for the Lord, went and did thus and such, right? So in the Pharisees, in the Pharisaical party, they took that word as kind of their motto, like, we're zealous, meaning when it comes time, we'll do what needs to be done to make sure we get rid of the sinners, right? So what Paul is telling them is, hey, listen, I was all the way on this extreme end of the religious political spectrum around here, and so he goes on to say, just as all of you are today, basically you're beating me up. I used to be somebody who beat people up. It's like, hey, I feel you. Like, I was right where you are. Believe me, I understand what you're trying to do here. I persecuted this way up to the point of death by binding both men and women and putting them in prison. As the high priest and the whole council of elders can testify about me, it's basically he can look over at those high priests and elders and say, hey, you guys, some of you guys are my classmates. some of you were some of you were at the feet of Gamaliel along with me. You remember me. I know you know me, right? That's part of the real emotion of this moment. This is Paul's culminating self-defense to his own people. He's not just arguing in the synagogue of Thessalonica anymore. He is at the temple of Jerusalem, presenting his case to his own people. From there, I also received letters to the brothers in Damascus, and I went there in order to bind those who were there and to bring them back to Jerusalem for punishment. Now, so what we're about to hear is the second time Luke will tell the story of Paul's conversion, and the second of three. So Paul will tell this story yet again in another trial down in Caesarea Maritima at the governor's palace. So if Luke tells you about an incident 3 times, it's really important, right? Right? I mean, it's 3 times. Remember how Peter repeats the story of the Cornelius is like, he repeats that story 3 times. Once when it happens, once when Peter tells about it, another time when he defends it. So he again. So for Luke, Paul's conversion is an absolutely critical part of his biography and really of the narrative of God's work in the church. So Paul goes on. While I was on my way and approaching Damascus about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone about me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? I answered, Who are you, Lord? Then he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Now those who were with me saw the light, but he did not hear the voice of the one who was speaking to me. I asked, What am I to do, Lord? The Lord said to me, Get up and go to Damascus. There you will be told everything that has been assigned to you to do. Since I could not see because of the brightness of that light, those who were with me took my hand and led me to Damascus. So a couple things to note here. First of all, is Luke adds the kind of that quality of verisimilitude by telling this story in a slightly different way than he told it the first time, because Luke is such a sensitive observer of human behavior, and that none of us tell a story the same way 3 times. We can't even tell a story the same way 2 times, right? I mean, for those of you who've been both at the 8 o'clock sermon and the 10:30 sermon, those are a little slightly different, right? And in the same way, Luke, I think he deliberately tells the story a little bit differently each time it comes up. There are going to be different aspects. So the little detail that is different here is that the phrase at the end that Jesus saying, get up and go to Damascus, there you will be told everything that has been assigned to you to do. Basically, it's go to the straight, Jesus told him to go to the straight street and all this, but that comes later. So in this version, a little bit of that narrative is compressed. And what we hear is, and what is also different is, since I could not see because of the brightness of that light, and this is mimicking the language of 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 6. And I just wanted to read that to you because it's a famous passage from Corinthians. It does appear on a Sunday, but it kind of helps you understand. So this is that verse from Corinthians. For it is the God who said, let light shine out of darkness, who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. That this light that Paul sees is something that, again, it seems, there seems to be an ambiguity around whether or not the light was, visible to everybody. Sometimes they hear the voice, but maybe they don't see the light. Sometimes they see the light, but they didn't. And so for Paul, it's a light. The important thing about the light is that it shines in his heart, and he sees the risen Jesus. And that this is this is part of that experience. It's about truly meeting the risen Jesus, Messiah. So he goes on to tell the story. A certain Ananias, who was a devout man according to the law, and again, Paul throws that in. That's a detail that Ananias was devout according to the law, is not in the first telling of this incident, right? But Paul adds it in here because it's important he thinks that gets him points with his Jerusalem audience, right? Ananias, he's a devout man according, he's one of us, he's a devout Jew. He, and well spoken of by all the Jews living there, came to me, and standing beside me, he said, Brother Saul, regain your sight. In that very hour I regained my sight and saw him. Then he said, the God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear his own voice. For you will be witness to all the world of what you have seen and heard. And this seeing here is not is a word that in a sense it's a different kind of seeing than what the other apostles received, and yet Paul, the fundamental fact is that Paul is sent. In a sense, it's not necessarily the same sort of opthing of the Lord, the same like ophthalmology that Paul. What this very subtle shading of the story is, it's not that Paul saw the Lord in the same way that the other 12 saw the Lord, but Paul's an apostle because he was sent like the other apostles were sent. Because that's the meaning of the word apostle, right? Is sent ones. The apostles are the sent ones. And so it's not so much about having seen Jesus in the flesh, so much as having received a gift from him to do his work. And that's what sets Paul out as an apostle. So it's just kind of a little shading of the story to make the point about Paul's apostleship. For you will be his witness. Again, the Greek word there is martyr. You will be his martyr to all the world and of what you have seen and heard. And now, why do you delay? Be baptized and have your sins washed away, calling on his name. The idea of sins being washed away is actually that expression is not very common in the New Testament, but it is unique to Paul. So in Paul, in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 11, Paul talks about sins being washed away in baptism. And so Luke here, what we see Luke doing is essentially what we think Luke is saying. This is a true Pauline kind of quote. This is something that Paul would say. And so this language of sins being washed away in baptism is something we get from Paul. That whole notion of the washing. And so then he continues, after I had returned to Jerusalem and while I was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance. Now, Paul does not tell his audience that he actually had to leave Damascus because he got in trouble with the Jewish community there. He's going to gloss over that little historical detail, and what Paul does is he condenses the narrative to bring himself back straight to Jerusalem, right? Because that's an important rhetorical to make. It's basically, I met the risen Jesus and I came straight back to Jerusalem. Now, of course, again, since we've read Luke's narrative, we know it took about 2 or 3 years for Paul to get back to Jerusalem. But again, that's not important rhetorically. And this is Luke's presenting Paul's speech. So, why would Paul tell him that? They don't need to know that. But he went to Jerusalem, and while I was praying in the temple, again, Paul, as a devout Jew, praying in the temple, in a sense that following Jesus Messiah is not something that, in a sense, changed his Jewishness in that sense. He fell into a trance. Now, this is something that it will remind his hearers and should remind us of Isaiah, right? Isaiah's vision in the temple. That when you fall, when you have a vision in the temple, it's significant. right? And so they would have heard kind of an Isaianic vision experience here. And I saw Jesus saying to me, hurry and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves know that in every synagogue I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And while the blood of your martyr, Stephen, it says witness in it, but I translated that for you, but the blood of your martyr, Stephen, and again, linking those, both Paul and Stephen together, instead using that word martyr in very close proximity, again, is Luke tipping his hand to the fact that, you know, Stephen gives a speech to the mob, and he will eventually give his life in witness to Jesus. Paul is now giving a speech to the mob. Eventually, Paul also will give his life to Jesus. And while the martyr Stephen was shed, the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I myself was standing by, approving and keeping the coats of those who killed him. Then he said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. And this is you see how Paul, in the differences of the retelling. In the first telling, the sending to the Gentiles is something that comes to him in the experience with Ananias back in Damascus. That's where he gets his commission to the Gentiles, is in the Damascus experience. But you see how Paul, in this retelling, he moves that commissioning to the epicenter of Jewish life. Basically, I went to the Gentiles because Jesus Messiah told me so right here, you know, just right over there in your temple. God told me he wanted the Gentiles to become a part of his people. Okay, that's like a mic drop. That's like a kind of like boom, and it gets the expected reaction. Up to this point, they listened to him. But once he tells them that he heard God in the person of Jesus telling him to go bring the Gentiles into God's people on the grounds of the temple, I don't think so. Then they shouted, away with such a fellow from the earth. I love that. It's like, we want him wiped off the face of the earth. Like, for he should not be allowed to live. And while they were shouting, throwing off their cloaks, tossing dust into the air, I mean, you just imagine it's just total bedlam in the crowd, and be like, ah, you know. And the tribune directed that he was to be brought into the barracks and ordered him to be examined by flogging, right? That too happened to Jesus, right? He's like, and this is an absolutely historically accurate presentation of Roman procedure, right? If you want to ask somebody some questions, you don't just bring them to the precinct. You warm them up a little bit. You gotta flog them. Then you ask them the questions. Don't waste your time asking questions before the flogging. It's like flog them first, then ask your questions. And this is part of the Romans. This is Roman psychology. I mean, this was official policy. They truly felt that you would only tell the truth if you'd basically been tuned up a little bit, you know. And so judicial torture was an essential aspect of the Roman legal system, right? And so he's going to be examined by flogging to find out the reason for this outcry against him. But when they tied him up with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who is uncondemned? I mean, I love it. This is Paul, cool as a cucumber. He has like they're tying him up, right? And he's got it like he's completely bound, and they're getting ready to flay his skin off his back. And he just says, hey, just a question. Is it legal? I love it. I just love it. When the centurion heard that, he went to the tribune and said to him, what are you about to do? This man is a Roman citizen. You know, like you're about to get into deep, deep doo-doo if you flog this Roman citizen. And when we talked about this same sort of thing happening, remember in Philippi where the magistrates flog him, and Paul waits until after the flogging to tell them. Here, Paul tells them before. I don't know, maybe he figured that these guys are actually really good at it, and you might want to play your get out of jail free card before they beat you this time. And so then the tribune came and asked Paul, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" And he said, "Yes." The tribune answered, "It cost me a large sum of money to get my citizenship." Paul said, "But I was born a citizen." Like, tough luck, old boy. It's like some of us are born to it. Immediately, those who were about to examine him, meaning those who were about to flog him, drew back from him. And the tribune also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. I mean, so not only you're not supposed to flog him, the fact that he actually bound Paul was enough to get him into trouble. And so they stand down. So we'll stop it there because then we'll move into the trial the next day. But again, you have here, and it's really for Paul in his spiritual and missionary journey. You have, in a sense, this great disappointment on his part. That his mission, the collection is not taken, but he knows that he's supposed to go to Jerusalem. He knows he's supposed to go to Jerusalem. He doesn't know, and he knows there's going to be suffering there, but he knows he has to go. And since he's not sure why, he thinks it's because he's supposed to deliver this, but you see, God has a way of, having his will be done. And so that in a sense, that Paul's witness to the faith was not going to necessarily come about through kind of a victoria, kind of a grand rapprochement between the Jerusalem church and the Gentile church. Ultimately, Paul's mission to the Gentiles was going to be changed or transformed in Jerusalem by him following in almost in a very close pattern the passion of the Lord that he served. So what you have here is essentially his people. He has now been handed over to the Gentiles. And from this point forward in the narrative, Paul is in Roman custody. I mean, this marks a fundamental transition. Paul is no longer a free man from this point forward. He is now under arrest, and for the years of the remaining years of Paul's life, it's going to be a life of being in Roman custody until the very end, until his martyrdom. And so we really have, again, a shift in Paul's own vocation, where he becomes what we know from his letters, his classic expression of the prisoner of the Lord. That he is finally, in a sense, and he's going to go to Rome, but not in the way that he originally thought he would be going to Rome. He's going to be going to Rome, but what remains constant is that he is going to go to Rome for Jesus' sake. So whether he, is on a missionary journey on a ship that he's chartered or something like that, or going as a Roman prisoner, Paul is going for Jesus. And throughout this narrative, this is something that I think we can take to heart ourselves, that when we are willing to give our lives over, our purposes to Jesus, that in a sense, he can be served by us no matter what the circumstances, right, of our lives. Even if our plan goes completely off the rails, right? And as far as Paul, I mean, really think about it. Paul's plan for Jerusalem couldn't have gone more wrong, right? The collection doesn't get accepted. He can't finish the purification. He tries to do this purification thing. That wounds up being interrupted, and now he's under Roman arrest, right? And he is and this last speech by him to his kinsmen is really his last plea. And in some ways you think maybe Paul thought, well, if I could just talk to them, if I could just go to the temple and talk to them, those guys in Ephesus, they were a hard lot to deal with. But if I go to the temple, maybe, just maybe. And you just get the sense that he held out that hope. Ultimately, his kinsmen according to the flesh were not going to be won over that way. They were not going to be argued into, in a sense, persuaded by a speech to believing Jesus. That was just not going to be the way it was going to happen. And but in the end, Paul is still going to serve the purpose of the gospel. He's still going to be engaged in missionary enterprise. And I think as we move forward through the narrative, just to keep that in mind, that Paul he's still busy testifying. He's going to have several trials. He's going to be in this sea journey to Rome. And at every step of the way, he's still going to tell his story about Jesus. So I guess, even when life goes off the rails for you, it's still an opportunity to tell about Jesus. Even when life goes off the rails and everything you planned on falls to pieces, God is still capable of working in your life. He's still capable of using you to be a blessing. So, Paul had it rough, and Paul said, imitate me, therefore, as I imitate the Lord Jesus. So when we find ourselves, kind of as a disappointment to ourselves in terms of what we thought we would accomplish by such and such, or what we thought we'd get done, you're in good company. Believe you me, you are in good company. And a good God can still work through you to be a blessing to others. And that's a great lesson from Paul in this part of Acts of the Apostles.